Hello and welcome. Inviting in our YouTube family now. I'm going to go ahead and take another deep breath. Once again, coming into this beautiful moment, we breathe in peace, we exhale love. And so today's topic is going to be we're going to be going into the first two of the final three tenets of living peace, which is release attachment to the mundane and release attachment to knowing. These past handful of weeks, we've been going through the Living Peace Code from my book, Living Peace. And it's much of what the center, our community, and then the student program is based around. 9 teachings to help us cultivate understanding of ourselves, of others, and of course, how to cultivate inner peace. First 3, just a quick recap. The first 3 are mastery of thought, mastery of impulse, mastery of emotion. And then we have ignorance is an illusion, we seek understanding. Chaos is an illusion, we seek harmony. And then last week we covered duality is an illusion, we seek transcendence, which that was an intense talk. So I definitely invite you all to go back and watch it if you have not already. So a little paragraph I like to read at the beginning each time. In Dunisha, the Living Peace Code is our anchor for clarity, presence, and peace. No matter what circumstances arise in our life, we can always return to the code to receive its stabilizing influence. And that is absolutely true. Even just memorizing it and reciting it allows us to remember all the ways that we kind of funk up our own mind and body with the thoughts that we think, the actions that we're doing. So when you have many people practice mantra or positive affirmations. So when you have kind of a belief system, and I wouldn't even call this, I guess it's a belief system, but it's based on fact. It's not faith, it's factual. When you have something very tangible and factual to come back to, that helps realign us to peace by understanding philosophy, psychology, and spirituality, it really does benefit our lives. So to start out, we have release the mundane, which sometimes people get confused by this tenet because they skip over the last tenet and they forget about duality and polarity. And so what ends up happening is that release the mundane almost becomes like where it turns into a positive versus negative, which is mundane versus spiritual. And that's not what we're advocating here. Go ahead and write this quote down. This is going to summarize everything. Your ordinary life is your spiritual life. Your ordinary life is your spiritual life. And I wanted to start off by saying that because, again, it can be easy to misinterpret this tenet. When we say release our attachments to the mundane world, people might think that there is a separation between the spiritual and the mundane, and that's not true at all. Everything is all encompassed within the spiritual, and really, what does even spiritual mean? A lot of times we think of it as an elevated state, something more divine, something more better. But the truth is that even just doing your chores, doing your tasks, showing up for work, showing up for conversations in your everyday life, when you bring your full presence to it, that is deliciously miraculous. You're able to feel that connection. You're able to, kind of like the connection many people feel when they go into the forest and they feel that oneness when you're walking through, where you just sit down and you allow all of your barriers to collapse and you're just existing. We're able to cultivate that feeling on a daily basis. And so when we recognize that our ordinary life is our spiritual life, it really helps us to cease comparing things. Because a lot of people, especially in the New Age spiritual circles, or even religious circles too, but just maybe different terminology, it's like we want to live up here. We're like, this shit I have to deal with on the daily basis is stressful. I don't want to have to, it's not fun to live with. But up here, when I'm maybe connected to spirit, connected to God, connected to whatever it is, maybe it's loved ones on the other side. We may be using this as an excuse to not be fully present with this. And we're always looking to rectify that. So what does release the mundane mean then? For us, release the mundane is making sure that we're looking at all the ways that we still get ourselves hung up. Maybe it might be in our behaviors, it might be in our thought processes, and oftentimes it's definitely in the ways that we might be losing our presence because of our chosen stress-filled lives. Not always self-chosen, but a lot of times it is chosen. You know, we chose to have this child, we chose to get married to this person, we chose this job, etc. And as a society, we chose to create society to look and work the way it is. And that's why even in politics, you know, it's a big trigger for a lot of people, but a lot of what politics is you're kind of directing the flow of how the future is going to unfold in certain countries. And so really looking at it from that angle, it kind of softens it. And you just say, okay, politics are kind of important. Maybe not the duality involved in it, where it is always this us against them mentality, or at least it has been more so in the past decade. But it's really interesting to see that we really, as a collective species, we do choose what we agree with and what we disagree with. And a lot of times all the time, that influences society and how our daily lives are then run. It's really fascinating. And so releasing the mundane has two arts associated. And so let's go ahead and fill in the blanks here. The first one is the art of simplicity. And the second one is the art of gratitude. And the art of simplicity is quite simple, unintended, in a sense that it's inviting us to slow down. It's reminding us that sometimes when you have a bit less, you can actually cultivate a lot more mindfulness in your life. And that's what I love, especially about Zen, and in particular, Japanese architecture and how they lay out their homes. A lot of it, there's beauty in spaciousness. There's beauty in less. And it's very different than sometimes what we're brought up here in America, where it's often more and more and more and more and more. And that's actually quite wonderful for, again, the society that we built, because that leads to more prosperity for various companies. And so you really develop this industry around buying more and more and more. But what's interesting is that attention and energy is always going to go in different directions. And so maybe when we start to shift and adopt these teachings more, maybe we're paying less on things, but we're actually investing more in ourselves, such as in programs, or such as in further education, or it could be in the community where we're building community and giving back. And so it's really interesting that energy and attention is always going to go in some way, some fashion. It never really shuts off. But what's beautiful about the art of simplicity is that we're inviting ourselves, if we notice that we're always kind of hung up on tangible things, or maybe intangible dramas, because it could go both ways. It could be the actual tangible things of our life that we have over sentiments to. Or it can also be maybe the relationships or the drama in those relationships. And so when we start to take a deep breath, returning and taking refuge within ourselves, simplifying our thoughts, simplifying, maybe it's just one day a week where we really choose to slow down and just observe everything that's going on. What ends up happening is we're able to start being aware of more gratitude in our lives and more appreciation in our lives. And that is followed by the check-in that I have us write down. In my busyness, comma, what do I overlook? In my busyness, comma, what do I overlook? And another way of writing that as well is, in my lethargy, comma, what do I overlook? In my lethargy, comma, what do I overlook? Because they're two sides of the same coin. Sometimes we're so busy with our tangible to-do lists that we overlook a lot of the relationships in our life, and we look at, even overlook the relationship within ourselves. We may not be treating our body and our mind and our spirit all that healthily. But also, I never judge people who are lethargic, because what's normally happening for them is that maybe they're not physically busy, but they're busy in here and they're busy in here. Because a lot of times depression and lethargy and all that jazz, it stems from a very busy mind and a very busy heart a wounded mind and a wounded heart where it's reliving a lot of negativity. And that sometimes can lead to non-action in the physical world. That's nothing to judge. So even though they may not look like they're working hard physically, they're working a lot, really hard up here and in here. And that's why it leads to a lot of suffering and perpetual exhaustion. Who's been there? Have you ever had just a day or week off and you've just been so exhausted, but nothing really happened? But you may have noticed that the exhaustion is coming from constantly the monkey mind, the hamster wheel going. And so that's why when we say, in my business or my busyness or lethargy, what am I overlooking? What am I overlooking? Or you can even say, who am I overlooking? Who am I overlooking? And that, of course, goes back to the arts of gratitude. And if we had Dunisha Emma here, I'd have her share a bit, because in her book, Journey to Within, because at the end of this program, and for people who adopt the Black Robe, we always have them start writing a book based off of the 9 tenets. And they have time to complete it. It's not an urgent thing, but she's the first one to ever complete it. And she wrote an exceptional chapter on gratitude. And even just coming down to, no matter where you're at, what can you find gratitude in? Even if it's just a toilet paper roll or clean water and this giant metal bird in the sky that takes us from point A to point B, and it gets us there safety, even though it seems very irrational and illogical that this heavy thing can be propelled into the air. It's fascinating. And so what's beautiful about gratitude is that no matter where we're at or how we're feeling, if we shift our awareness towards it, it can really increase our vibration. It can increase our well-being. But what's interesting, I was thinking about gratitude versus appreciation, because a lot of times, pretty much every person I've ever worked with, including me, the number one thing everyone's searching for or wanting more of is feeling appreciated in their life. Who feels that way? Like, you'd like to feel more appreciation, right? It almost, I don't know if it's everywhere in the world, but at least here in America, it seems to be one of the biggest unspoken things. And what gratitude seems to be more with, yeah, we can give our gratitude to someone, we could be grateful, but gratitude, it almost seems more about ourselves and raising our own vibration. But then appreciation is more like a gift. Showing, because you can show your gratitude, but giving appreciation, there's a difference there, because on one hand, we're saying, okay, I feel gratified here. But again, that seems more self. But then I feel appreciated here. It feels like it's coming from someone else. Does that make sense? Feeling gratified is feeling satisfied. But then the feeling of appreciation is coming from that external source. Does that make sense? And so we can go ahead and write that down as well. Our practice is going to be counting, fill in the blank, gratitudes, plus gifting, fill in the blank, appreciation. Counting gratitudes, gifting appreciation. And the practice for this chapter or this tenet in my book is, of course, called counting gratitudes. And I would say for probably a couple of years now, right? We've been doing that. Mm-hmm. And so every night we haven't skipped a single night, even when one of us was in a different state or a different town, we would still call each other up or text the gratitudes. And so for 2 years, at least 2 years, maybe more, consistently every night before we go to bed, we always recount our gratitudes for the day, starting with each other. And that's just a beautiful way to conclude the day and go into slumber each night. And it's so interesting how often in relationships, you really don't see that often. You know, wouldn't the world be a more beautiful place with more please and thank yous? It sounds so simple, but now let me challenge all of you and those of you listening at home. You know, think about how often you give praise and appreciation in comparison to how often you have judgments throughout the day, or you might be condemning yourself with negative self-talk, or you might be condemning other people with even just thought. You may not speak them, but you might think of them throughout the day when you're seeing other people. And so I'm guessing for most of humanity, it's quite, the scales are quite tipped more in the negative spectrum of judgment and condemnation. And even with how we raise our kids, a lot of times we're quick to scold. We're quick to say, don't do that with the tone. But it sometimes takes a bit more to follow up with the praise and really recognizing, what is in alignment here? What has been going great? Because the interesting thing about when things are going well, we often take things for granted. And it's so easy. When peace becomes the new norm, it's actually can be dangerous because we start to take that for granted. And then we might slip and fall away from the practices, or we might slip and fall away from giving appreciation on a regular basis, etc. Isn't that interesting? And so a lot of times I'll have students who I've worked with, and when their life's a shit show, they show up. But then when things start going well, they're just like, I can take a month or two off. And then shit goes south again. Not that there's anything wrong with south, but that's just the saying. Shit goes south, and then they show up again. And then after a couple sessions, they go away, and then they come back, and it's just this freaking yo-yo. And it's because they were more trying to solve one issue rather than fully embodying the peace within themselves. Because once you're able to fully actualize all the teachings within yourself, you're always going to do the teachings, not just when things are tough. You're going to do them consistently. And when you do them consistently, when a challenge arises, it's not coming from out of nowhere. You're normally able to recognize if something's building. And even if you're not, you're able to respond to it with grace, dignity, and peace versus freaking the F out or being a reactionist, being very reactive to the situation. And that's why, especially if for those of you who see any of us in robes, including those of ours in Arizona, we really look at this as a lifestyle to live every single day, and not just some fun certification program. And that's the beautiful thing about this. I always tell folks, and when they come and they're on my couch crying after haven't seen me in 3 months to a year or whatnot, no judgment. I think it's adorable. I'm just like, we'll get through this. But I'll often point out, I'm like, how's your practice been these past few months? And then it's like, And I say, isn't it interesting that had you been practicing this consistently the past 3 months, you would have been able to handle that situation so much more effectively. And it's always agreed upon that, absolutely. Because again, stress builds, exhaustion builds. And I even note within myself, if there's a week that I didn't really practice and then something hits me, it's so much more difficult to make sure that we're responding versus reacting, even just a week difference. Isn't that interesting? And so, of course, let's see, we have the notes. And just notes, we're going to just do a quick little thing. So you're going to do gratitude, parentheses, feeling. Gratitude, parentheses, feeling. Versus, or you can even just say and, because it's not a versus. But gratitude, parentheses, feeling, and appreciation, parentheses, gift. Appreciation, parentheses, gift. And again, this is not necessarily the only definition for these, but I'm just kind of trying to create some healthy distinguishment between them, some healthy discernment. So think of gratitude more as a feeling that we cultivate within, and then think of appreciation as something that we're gifting to others. I think that's just a kind of a great synopsis there. Okay, I think I covered everything on my notes. So let's go ahead and take a deep breath. So let's go ahead and move on to release attachments to knowing. Release attachments to knowing. This one, we're going to get deep even more. So it's going to be the art of humility and the art of vulnerability. The art of humility and the art of vulnerability. This, I would say, out of the 9 tenets, this one has to be, I would say, within the top 3 most difficult, and maybe the top 2 most sneaky, if not the most sneaky, if not the sneakiest of all the tenets. Because yes, there's mastery of thought and we start working on it, but release the mundane, especially after we've been doing so many of the tenets, we start to think that we know shit. And we start to, it's even in this work, it's very easy to fall into self-justification. And another word I like to use is negative self-certainty. Write that down. Negative self-certainty. So we fall into self-justification and we fall into negative self-certainty. And what's tricky is maybe where we've been good about non-judgment towards others, but I don't doubt for a minute that sometimes even more than judging others, it's harder to lessen our judgment towards others. It's often harder to lessen the judgment we have towards ourselves. Who has a negative belief system about yourself that really puts into question your work, your idea of your own self-worth, self-esteem, and self-confidence, right? It's difficult. But all of that is just an idea. It's just a notion. That because of your life experiences and because of your interactions with others and the different things that you've tried and maybe failed, you've developed an identity. You've developed notions and ideas around certain things that really keep you trapped. And often you'll say, well, it's just, I know it, it's true. But it's not necessarily true. It's just an idea. But the dangerous thing about ideas is that when you practice them long enough, they become almost real, to where it's very difficult to distinguish between fiction from reality, fact from fiction. Because you've had this experience so many times, it's almost as if it is set in stone. But the reason why we keep having experiences again and again and again of the same kind is often because we're behaving and reacting the same way again and again and again. And we have very strong belief systems that do activate the laws of the universe, such as the laws of attraction, that bring in certain experiences. And then because we have a filter in our mind based off of our biased belief systems, a lot of times we're not able to receive the full information being presented to us, and it gets filtered through in a way that we already agree with or disagree with. And so we're not able to see the full picture. So you can see it's a lot. And this tenet is so important and so I do not prefer the word dangerous, but there's a lot of danger in our knowing. And something I wrote down, you can write this under the notes. Knowledge of something. Ooh, this gives me goose shivers. Knowledge of something can be mistaken. Knowledge of something can be mistaken for wisdom or truth. For wisdom or truth. And so a lot of times, including myself at times, we'll say, oh, I know that already. Really what you're saying is I'm aware of that already. But if we're not doing it, then do we truly know it? Because if we truly know it, it would actually influence our behavior. When you dive deeper into this work and you realize the harm that your actions are causing on the planet or other people, it does change the way that you live your life on all avenues. So instead of just being aware of something, we really cultivate an embodiment of the wisdom. But now let me go back. Knowledge of something can be mistaken for wisdom or truth. We have a knowledge of the experiences that we've had up to this point, or maybe we have the knowledge of these interactions we've had with another person up to this point. And so then it colors our vision, and it creates a bias within ourselves because we think we know. But we're mistaking simple awareness and observation for hard wisdom and hard truth. Does that make sense? And so we must always make sure that we're, again, going back to ignorance is an illusion, we seek understanding, that we're always softening our opinions, softening our judgments, softening all the ways in which that we create biases and prejudices within ourselves. And part of it is understanding that every single one of us in this room has biases and even prejudices. And even if we're very accepting, there are things that we are still challenged with. And maybe we don't recognize them that often because we've created little safe bubbles for ourselves. So we're not triggered on the daily because we're limiting the information that we're seeing from the world. But and it's okay to do that if it's not serving you, but at the same time, use the things that trigger you to unlock your mind. So don't just run away and never look back. Take some distance, but then return and work through it. That way, when you do leave, and if it ever follows you and it hits you out of the blue in the future, you're not going to lose yourself. Does that make sense? So let's go ahead and do the check-in now. I love this. How do I seize myself and occupy my mind? How do I seize myself and occupy my mind? How do I seize myself and occupy my mind? So in other words, of how do I take hold of myself and trap myself with my thoughts? And what am I choosing to occupy my mind with? A lot of times what we're choosing to occupy our minds with are pretty rough things. But what's fascinating is that we really take hold, trap ourselves, steal ourselves. And then we create this idea of what we're good at, what we're not good at, what we can do, what we can't do, what's safe, what's unsafe. And even our likes and dislikes can really create a very limiting reality for us to exist within, rather than allowing ourselves to remain open. And a lot of times we seize ourselves from happiness. We seize ourselves from opportunities. And a lot of times this takes the form of our self-worth and our self-esteem and our belief on whether or not we deserve respect, kindness, love, or peace. And so we seize ourselves and occupy our mind with these thoughts that are in extreme opposition to peace, to happiness, to love, to well-being. One of the hardest things to do often, the number one thing that every student that I work with, or even client long-term, is part of my job is to present peace as an option in a way that is pragmatic and practical. Because for a lot of people, they may have never known peace in their entire existence. So when I'm expressing, hey, this peace thing, it's pretty rad. They'll say, well, that's just a fantasy, Alaric. It's not possible because my whole life, I've experienced deep pain, deep abuse, deep suffering. And so it's my opportunity, our opportunity as a community, to show and present peace, that no matter what anyone has been through, there is an avenue to where it's possible, that we can heal our mind, body, and soul, and cultivate. Maybe sometimes our bodies cannot be fully healed, but we can heal this up here. And we can heal the way in which we're interacting with other people on a day-to-day basis that creates environments of well-being. And everyone is deserving of peace. That's one of the Dunisha non-negotiables. Not to be too dogmatic here, but one of our big virtues is, no matter what anyone's been through, no matter what anyone has done in their life, even if it's quite atrocious, we do advocate that everyone is still deserving of peace and well-being, because we understand that even people who are abusers, why were they abusers in the first place? Well, they didn't have peace and well-being, and so their pain spilled out onto other people. And so it's our opportunity to help bridge that gap. And again, if Dunisha Emma was here, I'd have her talk about how for many years now she's wrote and corresponded with inmates on death row, and she had lovely conversations with them and gave them that, you know, that dignity of still being a human being and deserving of respect and peace and kindness. And what's interesting is, again, I wish you were here. I know you'll end up watching this. I wish you were here. She would often express how a lot of times that they do come to peace within their life, because they're forced to really look at that mortality. And what's interesting is some inmates on death row have more peace than those of us here, out and about. And again, that goes back to, how do we seize ourselves and occupy our mind? How do we gel ourselves up and really make us unable to see the beauty all around us? The beauty that's already present. So let's take a deep breath. So the art of humility, let me just go through this real quick. A lot of times if you look up in the dictionary, it will say something along the lines of modest or low view of oneself. That's not the humility that I'm speaking of here. So humility is often almost like a low self-esteem. But really how we teach it here is it's not worrying about your self-esteem. Not really judging ourselves one way or another. So rather than low view, we're looking for no view, if that makes sense. And so in a lot of ways, humility is getting out of that negative self-certainty, but also getting out of overly inflated positive self-certainty, because both of them are just illusions. Both of them are just projections of our ego on reality. And however we're coloring it, you know, it's hard not to color it, but we just try to soften it and come back to the equilibrium as much as possible. Because again, if it's high up, eventually it's going to come down. And then if it's down here, well, we already know what that feels like. And so really what we're looking for is just to remain on stable ground and not needing to inflate, but also not needing to deflate anyone around us. And then the art of vulnerability. I love this one. One of the quotes, even in my first edition of Living Peace years ago, I always said something along the lines of, genuine strength is being able to walk outside without your armor on. You know, a lot of times we see like this idea, this imagery of like hardcore battle armor with swords and shields as this like idea of strength. But really, is that genuine strength, or is it projected strength? Because what's really going on underneath the armor? And if you removed all that armor, chances are you'd find someone who's struggling with insecurity, and that's why the armor was there in the first place. So as monks, and what we're teaching everyone here and at home and consistently, is being able to walk out that door without the sword, without the shield, without the armor. And can we feel secure within ourselves to do so without needing to present a mask to the world? That's what the aim is. And it's okay if it takes a while to get to that point, but that's what the aim is. But how do we get to that point? Well, the practice is exposure, parentheses open, being open to, and then the fill in the blank is annihilation. And I'll go ahead and spell that for you guys. ANNIHILATION. ANNIHILATION. Exposure to annihilation. And then the parentheses is of notions. Opening ourselves up again and again and again to allowing our notions, our ideas, our prejudices, our biases, our opinions, our judgments, allowing them and exposing them to be annihilated by the world. This is a very Zen hardcore thing, because it's allowing our ego to be subjugated to annihilation again and again and again and again and again and again and again, but without feeling threatened again and again and again and again and again. Because normally when we open ourselves up to others and then we're judged, it just wounds our ego so much that we say, F that, I don't want to go back into that situation ever again. And a lot of times that might be true. Maybe that was an unsafe situation. You learned something valuable from it. But a lot of times what happens is that we open ourselves up and our gifts to the world and even our heart, and then it's taken for granted. Maybe it happens the first relationship you've ever been in. You're so excited, you open your heart up, and then it gets smashed because the other person didn't feel the same way. And then you say, well, F that, and then you close it up. But unfortunately, that does not help anyone or anything. So it's learning to be strong enough to go outside, go into the world consistently, be okay with this realization that annihilation does happen to our ego, and recognize that it's actually all just notion-based. And this annihilation actually doesn't have to hurt, because why it hurts is because the ego is running the show, and it tells you that that judgment that from that other person needs to wound you and scar you for the rest of your life. But really, it's just an idea that we're agreeing to all the judgments. And so I would say the very essence of this place existing is because, you know, I had to keep showing up, allowing my heart to be annihilated and broken 100 times over, because that's the very nature of this work. And if we closed ourselves off, what ends up happening is that, especially as entrepreneurs, especially as people who are looking for love in their life, especially as anyone who wants to experience peace on a daily basis, if this is closed, love has a hard time getting out, and it definitely has a hard time coming in. And I like to use the analogy of a flower in your heart, that if it's closed, how can the bees come and pollinate it, right? And create honey, to create sweetness in your life. And so a lot of times in Dunisha, we spend a lot of time on training our students on how not to be so offended, on how not to be taking things so personally to where it causes deep hurt and deep depression. Does that make sense? Because again, it's the annihilation of notions, the annihilation of judgments within ourselves, the judgments that we're accepting from other people. And when we expose ourselves to the world and we're not accepted, it's not the end of the world. It really isn't. Does that make sense? And then I can't remember who said this, but it was a Zen master, or maybe not Zen, but Buddhist master, who said, enlightenment is the ego's greatest disappointment. Enlightenment is the ego's greatest disappointment. And that's why enlightenment is so challenging, is because although we're not looking to destroy the ego, what we are looking to tear down are all of the notions and ideas about life that we developed that have created a negative self-certainty. We think what we know to be true about others and ourselves. We think what we know to be true about others and ourselves. Keyword, we think. But just because, and this is a quote in my book, just because we have a thought or feel a feeling, it does not necessarily make it true. And that's what this tenet encapsulates, it encompasses, it emphasizes. So on that note, let's take a breath. So that was the tenet 8 and 9 from my book, Living Peace. Release the mundane with the art of simplicity and the art of gratitude, and then release knowing with the art of humility and the art of vulnerability. Thank you for joining us today. Next week, I'll be going through the final tenet, which is release self. Whew, that'll be a fun one. And so, as always, thank you for those of you joining in at home. You can watch the previous videos on our YouTube channel. Please remember to subscribe and hit that like button if you do so, if you feel inclined and enjoyed this video. And as always, there are links down below for any donations. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.